I'm Emily Geddes.
I'm Meredith Hutchison-Hartley.
I'm Frank Hutchison.
And welcome back to the Hidden History of Business podcast.
Now, in 2004, an online survey identified the 100 greatest Black Britons of all time. Number 1 on the list was a Jamaican businesswoman and nurse, though she preferred the term Doctress. Her name was Mary Seacole. Now, if you start looking Mary Seacole up online, you will see her described as a nurse. Now, at the time, mid-1800s, there weren't really any formal nursing education programs. Really, when you look at what Mary Seacole did, she was really kind of more than a nurse, at least of what they were described at that time. She used traditional medicines from both her Caribbean and African backgrounds. She performed an autopsy at one point. She did minor surgery on wounds that soldiers received and others. She had intimations of the contagion theory. She was focused on nutrition and cleanliness. This was more than nursing as it was generally seen in the early 1800s.
Or even today. I mean, nurses don't do autopsies.
No, not generally speaking. She was a contemporary of Florence Nightingale, and she was on the front lines of the Crimean War. She's a fascinating character who traveled widely, combined her business and medical skills, developed a sort of social entrepreneurship in the mid-1800s, and was the first Black woman to publish her autobiography in Britain.
So let's talk about this idea of social entrepreneurship. What we're talking about is this idea that entrepreneurs and startups are trying to solve society's problems. And that premise is that they're going to use business techniques to solve social problems. This has been applied to the medical industry, to addressing poverty, to housing crises. That's where we see a lot of this in the modern world right now. But it's not really a new concept. And we're going to talk about how Mary Seacole was actually using the same concept, applying business techniques to address social problems of her gender being restricted, of her social class being restricted, of using business to address a need that wasn't being dealt with, a problem she saw all around her in her community.
There's also the use of business to support social causes. Not just using business for social causes, but using business to support the social causes.
Well, yeah, the whole point is it is using business to solve a problem facing society. An example might be startups now that are focusing on trying to lower the cost of medical care by providing new resources, new techniques to produce lower cost testing methods that can then be used to lower the cost of healthcare. Rather than relying on government regulation or waiting for the healthcare industry to reform, they're using their business startup tactics to try to affect that change from the business side of things.
Mary Seacole was born Mary Grant in 1805 in Kingston, Jamaica. She was the daughter of a Scottish soldier in the British Army and a free Black Jamaican doctress, which meant that she used herbal and traditional Caribbean and African medicine. Her mother also ran a boarding house, and Mary identified herself as Creole rather than as Black. Legally, she would have been classified as mulatto and would have had limited civil rights in Jamaica at the time. Slavery was technically abolished in 1834 in the West Indies. And I say technically because what happened, slavery was technically abolished in the West Indies, including Jamaica, in 1834. Now, I say technically because the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 transformed, magically, slaves into indentured servants.
That's helpful.
Well, they technically weren't owned anymore, but they were still bound to their previous owners as indentured servants. This program didn't work out really well.
I can't imagine why.
Yeah, and in 1838, the apprenticeship program was abolished, and the actual emancipation occurred at that point. So as she was growing up, Mary learned her initial nursing skills from her mother. She spent several years living with an elderly woman in the area, a patroness during her youth. She became educated while she lived there. This woman basically treated her as a granddaughter, and she received a great deal of her education there while still able to interact with her mother at home and spend time with her family. Mary had the opportunity to travel to London twice in the early 1820s, and she returned to Jamaica in 1825. She was able to travel to the Bahamas, to Cuba, to Haiti during the early 1830s. She was traveling with her mother, and they were collecting information about local traditional medicines. They were doing some nursing along the way as they traveled. So all during her youth, she had the opportunity to gain more knowledge and more practice. There's a really fun quote in her autobiography, and I'll talk more about that later, but she described that process. She said, "My mother kept a boarding house in Kingston and was, like very many of the Creole women, an admirable doctress, in high repute with the officers of both services and their wives, who were from time to time stationed at Kingston. It was very natural that I should inherit her tastes, and so I had from my early youth a yearning for medical knowledge and practice which has never deserted me. I saw so much of my mother and of her patients that the ambition to become a doctress early took firm root in my mind, and I was very young when I began to make use of the little knowledge I had acquired from watching my mother upon a great sufferer, my doll. Whatever disease was most prevalent in Kingston, be sure my poor doll soon contracted it. I have had many medical triumphs in later days and saved some valuable lives, but I really think that few have given me more real gratification than the rewarding glow of health which my fancy used to picture stealing over my patient's waxen face after long and precarious illness." Isn't that just adorable?
That is. What a wit.
I love that. In 1836, Mary married Edwin Horatio Seacole. He was a merchant who was apparently fairly sickly, of poor constitution. She had a series of unfortunate incidents. Their provision store failed, then the boarding house burned down in 1843, then her husband died in 1844 after a long period of illness during which she nursed him. And then her mother died later that year.
Wow.
So she had just a series of very difficult events. But she pulled herself together, and in 1850, cholera came to Jamaica. Her hypothesis was that it was brought in on a steamer from New Orleans in Louisiana. So
That's
this is
germ theory right there.
Yeah, that's some contagion theory going on there. Which in her autobiography, she talks about how her people on Jamaica had this idea of contagion theory for generations, which I found really, really interesting.
So, I mean, that right there is a solid misconception we have, that somehow germ theory was invented in the 1800s by European scientists.
Mm-hmm.
Louis Pasteur.
Right, but it was existing there. And let's, be clear what we mean by contagion theory here.
That there are certain diseases that if you put a healthy person next to a person with those diseases, the healthy person will catch those diseases.
Which is a shift from what the strong European belief had been, that it was caused by
Miasma,
right? By bad air,
right.
By an imbalance of the humors, by, at one point even they thought that women having stressed pregnancies was caused by the sound of priests bringing the incense and the bells through, that it was disturbing people and upsetting them. So actually comprehending the idea that diseases are a thing that can pass from person to person was a huge deal.
Well, it also gave them the advantage of being able to contain the diseases, which was an important thing, because in a lot of cases, the treatment for them was minimal.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could at least isolate them, and we later on see this, where you'd have notices put up on the doors saying, hey, this house is quarantined. Mm-hmm. And that's where it all started.
So in her autobiography, she says, "In the year 1850, the cholera swept over the island of Jamaica with terrible force. Our idea, perhaps an unfounded one, was that a steamer from New Orleans was the means of introducing it into the island. Anyhow, they sent some clothes on shore to be washed, and poor Dolly Johnson, the washerwoman, whom we all knew, sickened and died of the terrible disease. While the cholera raged, I had but too many opportunities of watching its nature, and from a Dr. B., who was then lodging in my house, received many hints as to its treatment, which I afterwards found invaluable." So here again, she was gathering information from every source she could.
Identifying patient zero, even.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
That's huge.
After this cholera epidemic, she decided to travel to Panama, where her brother had set up a hotel similar to the boarding house that her mother had. This was kind of a family business.
Yeah, and pretty critical during that time period. People were traveling a lot.
Well, Panama is important because it is on the isthmus, and if you wanted to go to the California gold fields, you had to either cross the country, which was a slow and laborious process, or you could take a ship, and if you didn't go to Panama, you had to go all the way down around South America, around Cape Horn, and that was a long voyage. Going across Panama shortened the trip by months.
And you just had a lot of sea travel at the time and a lot of moving between this area. There's a lot of economic development happening, a lot of investment projects, a lot of colonialism.
Reading her autobiography about this period, she actually talks a great deal about Americans and about the gold prospectors. She did not have a particularly high opinion of Americans.
I can't imagine why.
Yeah. So she visited her brother in Panama in 1851 at his hotel, and very soon after she arrives, a cholera epidemic hits.
That's convenient.
Isn't it, though?
Yeah. So she's just dealt with this intense cholera epidemic. She goes somewhere and there's another one. So she actually has, current experience dealing with it at a high volume.
Yes.
Plus that concept of germ theory.
Very recent experience.
Which I've got to say, I find it really interesting also that she understood the idea that a load of laundry could transfer a disease. Mm-hmm. Because even the beginnings of germ theory was focused on people transferring it, sneezing on someone, touching someone. Human contact was the deal. But people weren't fully investigating the idea of objects being carriers for disease. That's a very sophisticated understanding of germ theory.
So this is what she says in her autobiography. It was destined that I should not be long in Cruces, that's in Panama, before my medical skill and knowledge were put to the test. Before the passengers for Panama had been many days gone, it was found that they had left one of their number behind them, and that one, the cholera. I believe that the faculty have not yet come to the conclusion that the cholera is contagious, and I am not presumptuous enough to forestall them, but my people have always considered it to be so. And the poor Cruces folks did not hesitate to say that this new and terrible plague had been a fellow traveler with the Americans from New Orleans or some other of its favorite haunts. So there you have her identifying the idea that cholera is contagious with my people have always considered it to be so. And then describing this discovery of cholera when she's in Panama, she says, a Spaniard, an old and intimate friend of my brother, had supped with him one evening, and upon returning home had been taken ill, and after a short period of intense suffering had died. So sudden and so mysterious a death gave rise to the rumor that he had been poisoned, and suspicion rested for a time, perhaps not unnaturally, upon my brother, in whose company the dead man had last been. Anxious for many reasons, the chief one perhaps the position of my brother, I went down to see the corpse. A single glance at the poor fellow showed me the terrible truth. The distressed face, sunken eyes, cramped limbs, and discolored, shriveled skin were all symptoms which I had been familiar with very recently, and at once I pronounced the cause of death to be cholera. Now, the people in the town did not like that diagnosis.
No.
They were not excited to hear that, and so they did not necessarily believe her at first. By 12 o'clock that morning, one of the Spaniard's friends was attacked similarly, and the very people who'd been most angry with me a few hours previously came to me now eager for advice. There was no doctor in town. The nearest approach to one was a little timid dentist who was there by accident, and who refused to prescribe for the sufferer, and I was obliged to do my best. Selecting from my medicine chest, I never travel anywhere without it, what I deemed necessary, I went hastily to the patient, and at once adopted the remedies I considered fit. It was a very obstinate case, but by dint of mustard emetics, warm fomentations, mustard plasters on the stomach and the back, and calomel, at first in large and then in gradually smaller doses, I succeeded in saving my first cholera patient in Cruces.
Wow.
So there you have it. Just a little window into the Panama cholera epidemic and how she handled things there.
And also a degree of, forensic investigation of a corpse, where people assume that there's a crime that's been committed, and she's using science, she's using symptoms to direct in another way.
She also continued to learn as she went along, again from her autobiography. One of the really out-of-the-ordinary things that she did was in the middle of this epidemic, one of the children that she had been caring for, an orphan, this makes me so sad, of about 1 year old, died from cholera.
Wow.
And she decided that she wanted to take this child and examine it. She did an autopsy on this child to try to learn more about the disease and what it did to the body, and maybe learn how she could better treat the patient. She did this autopsy and talks about how it was the only one that she ever did, and it was somewhat troubling, but she said, "It seems a strange deed to accomplish, and I am sure I could not wield the scalpel or the substitute I then used now, but at that time the excitement had strung my mind up to a high pitch of courage and determination, and perhaps the daily, almost hourly scenes of death had made me somewhat callous. I need not linger on the scene nor give the readers the results of my operation. Although novel to me and decidedly useful, they were what every medical man well knows." She didn't have any other medical assistance there. she did what she could in that instance to learn what she could to try to help.
Well, also
people.
dealing with a personal tragedy, because, I mean, can you imagine what it takes to be able to do that on someone who you've cared for?
Yes.
And a 1-year-old. I mean,
Right.
you have this natural inclination to protect the young.
But it also shows how committed she was to trying to solve this problem, and how she knew that you could use the science of the body to understand things better, to prevent illness better. You didn't have to feel that you were at the mercy of fortune.
So after completing this autopsy, she says, again in her autobiography, "The knowledge I had obtained thus strangely was very valuable to me, and was soon put into practice. But that I dreaded boring my readers, I would fain give them some idea of my treatment of this terrible disease. I have no doubt that at first I made some lamentable blunders, and maybe lost patients which a little later I could have saved. I know I came across the other day some notes of cholera medicines which made me shudder, and I dare say they've been used in their turn and found wanting. The simplest remedies were perhaps the best: mustard plasters and emetics and calomel. The mercury applied externally, where the veins were nearest the surface, were my usual resources. Opium I rather dreaded, as its effect is to incapacitate the system from making any exertion, and it lulls the patient into a sleep which is often the sleep of death. When my patients felt thirsty, I would give them water in which cinnamon had been boiled." So that's rehydration. That's a very important aspect of treatment of cholera.
And another aspect of it was boiled.
Yes.
That means that the water was germ-free.
And cinnamon can have antiseptic effects as well.
Yes.
Absolutely. One stubborn attack succumbed to an additional dose of 10 grains of sugar of lead, mixed in a pint of water, given in doses of a tablespoonful every quarter of an hour. Another patient, a girl, I rubbed over with warm oil, camphor, and spirits of wine. But after all, one great conclusion, which my practice in cholera cases enabled me to come to, was the old one, that few constitutions permitted the use of exactly similar remedies, and that the course of treatment which saved one man would, if persisted in, very likely have killed his brother. So I find it very, very interesting. Some of the medicines that she describes, the mercury and the lead, we know today are toxic.
Incredibly toxic.
At the time, that was not as well understood, and she was making use of the best knowledge that she had at the time. But I love this excerpt because it talks about how she learned by a process of trial and error. This wasn't working, so she tried this, and this worked for this person, but it wouldn't work for this other person. So she really was engaging in almost the scientific process of better learning how to treat this cholera disease. Another innovation during this time was that she would charge the rich for these treatments, but she would treat the poor for free. I mean, all of these medicines cost money.
A lot.
And the poor couldn't afford them. But she was not willing to simply allow them to die because they couldn't afford treatment. So she charged the rich, she charged the people who could afford it, and then she treated the poor for free. Now, it helped that there was very little competition, as we mentioned, except for that timid little dentist.
It's a little bit of, skewering your competition there. Just a smidge.
Just a little bit there. That's where the social entrepreneurship, I think, comes in a little bit. That she was charging the people who could afford it, but offering the service for free to those who couldn't.
And she understood she had a monopoly, so she could charge what she needed to. And that also means she had to have calculated out what everything cost, and she knew how to distribute those prices to make it viable and still make a profit.
Now, she actually opened her own hotel in Panama, just across the way from her brother's. But interestingly, even though it's called a hotel, she didn't actually house any people there. It was a table d'hôte. I'm sure I butchered that. It's a French term, but it basically means a restaurant. It was a large building that had 2 rooms, a small one that was her personal bedroom, and then a large, basically, dining hall. She fed people there, and she still did some medical treatments on the side. But so she had her own hotel there in Panama near her brother, who was a more normal hotel where people stayed overnight, what we think of as a hotel.
And it's also a form of diversification, which is what a lot of startups, and especially social entrepreneurship startups, have to do now. You have to diversify your revenue stream because some of the activities you have to do aren't going to make a lot of money. So you use the large clients, you use other services to feed the real revenue stream.
Now, in late 1852, she traveled back to Jamaica for a little while. She did encounter some racial prejudice along the way. She tried to book passage on an American ship, and in her autobiography, she describes how she went on board and the other passengers essentially said that she was not welcome to take this ship, so she disembarked and bought a ticket, had to wait a little while and bought a ticket on a British ship that she didn't have any trouble traveling on. But she went back to Jamaica, and soon after she got there was an outbreak of yellow fever. So it was a pretty severe epidemic there. She talked about helping to nurse these people through their yellow fever. It was a bad outbreak. There were a lot of deaths there.
And these outbreaks weren't uncommon. We're dealing with a tropical area. We're dealing with a lot of travel. We're dealing with poor sanitation. So it's not that she was just lucky. It's that literally you had these many outbreaks everywhere people lived, where they went. There was an incredibly high mortality rate.
Well, yes, we talked about Mary Anning. Of the 10 children born to her parents, only 2 survived.
And again, from her autobiography, I returned to Jamaica just in time to find my services with many others needful, for the yellow fever never made a more determined effort to exterminate the English in Jamaica than it did in that dreadful year. So violent was the epidemic that some of my people fell victims to its fury, a thing rarely heard of before. My house was full of sufferers, and remember, she had a boarding house still. After it burned in 1843, they rebuilt. My house was full of sufferers, officers, their wives and children. Very often they were borne in from the ships in the harbor, sometimes in a dying state, sometimes after long and distressing struggles with the grim foe to recover. Habituated as I had become with death in its most harrowing forms, I found these scenes more difficult to bear than any I had previously borne a part in. And for this reason, perhaps, that I had not only to cheer the deathbed of the sufferer, but far more trying task, to soothe the passionate grief of wife or husband left behind. So she was continuing this practice of nursing, of caring for the ill. The medical authorities in Jamaica, the government, sent for her to help nurse the sick at Up Park Camp, which was a military installation about a mile away from Kingston. She said, I went there and did my best, but it was little we could do to mitigate the severity of the epidemic. Of course, my medical skill did not rust for want of practice. She had a lot of practice taking care of the ill.
Yeah.
Now, at about this time, she went back to Panama to settle her business ventures there, kind of close up her hotel at that point. And that is about when she learned about the Crimean War. And Frank is going to talk about that.
Well, the Crimean War is one of those wars that most people think of it only as the charge of the Light Brigade. You know, there's movies been made of it, you know, Earl Flynn charging and killing the bad guy and everything else. It really came about because Russia, for centuries, had been trying to expand south to get a warm water port so that their fleet could enter out into the oceans at any time. Because in the north, their harbors would be frozen solid for several months of the year. At the same time, the Ottoman Empire was in decline. It had been kind of going downhill, and of course it will disappear shortly after World War I. But Russia was looking to expand. The Ottoman Empire was not really in a position to do much about it, although there's still a force. But then you also had the United Kingdom and France, who were looking over there and saying, we really don't want Russia, which is considered to be this great military power, getting access to the ocean. And the immediate cause of the war was the fact that the French were worried about how Catholics were being treated in the Holy Land, and the Russians were concerned about how the Orthodox Christians were being treated. They were both kind of saying, hey, we're sort of the protectorate of these people, and they wanted the Ottoman Empire to treat them better. Well, there was a lot of diplomacy going on. Everybody sort of misread this situation. Great Britain was trying to mediate, but they ended up siding with France. Finally, Russia started making a move in the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire declared war, and then Great Britain and France entered on the side of the Ottoman Empire, along with Sardinia, which we don't hear about anymore, but it's one of those places that was in the Balkans. So you had what was almost a world war at that time.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like the setup for World War I.
It was one of the causes of World War I. It was going to set, you might say, the table setting for the war to come. And there would be more wars, but it would definitely be there because it showed weaknesses in several of the powers, especially the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, as well as the Ottoman Empire. The war actually started in the Balkans, as I mentioned, when Russia started to invade. The Ottoman Empire kind of held them back. France and England sent troops. Biggest thing you can say about this war was that it demonstrated the incompetence of just about everybody in the war. In fact, I love the quote from Karl Marx, who described it as, there they are, the French doing nothing and the British helping them as fast as possible.
Ow.
The biggest part of the war took place in its namesake, the Crimean Peninsula, because that was where Russia had the bulk of their military power, especially their fleet.
Can you explain exactly where that's located?
That is in the Black Sea, and it's on a peninsula. It's kind of at the north part of the Black Sea, and at the very tip of it, sort of, is Sebastopol, which is where the Russian fleet was located.
So we're talking really directly to the east of Romania, south of Ukraine.
Yes.
Modern-day Ukraine.
Yes, and north of Turkey. And the charge of the Light Brigade is probably the most famous incident in the war because it was an example of gross incompetence. Although some historians now say, hey, it accomplished its purpose. The cavalry was supposed to charge the enemy and break them up, blunt their charge, kind of dissipate them. And the charge of the Light Brigade did exactly that. After that charge, the Russian cavalry said, hey, no way are we going to charge these people because of miscommunications on the battlefield. They were given an order to charge battery, and what the commander really wanted was a battery that's fairly close to them, but they couldn't see it because they were literally in a valley. The only battery they could see was at the end of this long valley. They had cannons facing them, but they also had cannons to the right and to the left.
Oh, dear.
And so they charged. Out of 730 some odd members, about 240 of them became casualties. A horrendous amount. Of course, if you watch the movie, Errol Flynn, they go riding all the way through and they end up smashing the cavalry.
Yeah, but this caused massive casualties, massive illness, massive health needs.
The Crimean War was like most wars up until this point. The British suffered a total of about 21,000 deaths in the war. Of the 21,000, only 3,000 of them died in battle. The rest of them died primarily from disease, which was very common. You saw this even like in the Civil War. A lot of disease, because you have a lot of people back together, poor nutrition, poor sanitation. Diseases would be ripe. And of course...
Which is exactly the place where Mary Seacole's expertise would come in handiest. So in 1854... Mary Seacole traveled from Panama to England. Initially, she was looking after some interests that she had in gold mining businesses. Like we mentioned before, she knew a lot of gold miners going back and forth in Panama. But when she got there, she decided that she could be of use in this war effort. In her autobiography, she says, "My first idea, and knowing that I was well fitted for the work and would be the right woman in the right place, the reader can fancy my audacity, was to apply to the War Office for the post of hospital nurse. Among the diseases which I understood were most prevalent in the Crimea were cholera, diarrhea, and dysentery, all of them more or less known in tropical climates, and with which, as the reader will remember, my Panama experience had made me tolerably familiar. Now no one will accuse me of presumption if I say that I thought, and it so afterwards proved, that my knowledge of these human ills would not only render my services as a nurse more valuable, but would enable me to be of use to the overworked doctors." So she went and she applied to the War Office and was turned down. She also applied to the Crimean Fund, which was paying to send people to the area to help, and she was turned down by them as well. So she faced refusal on several different fronts. And then in her autobiography she said, "I was so conscious of the unselfishness of the motives which induced me to leave England, so certain of the service I could render among the sick soldiery, and yet I found it so difficult to convince others of these facts. Doubts and suspicions arose in my heart for the first and last time, thank heaven. Was it possible that American prejudices against color had some root here? Did these ladies shrink from accepting my aid because my blood flowed beneath a somewhat duskier skin than theirs?"
Aye.
She just kind of leaves it there. But at that point, she decides that she is going to go whether they want her there or not. She partners with a distant relative of her dead husband. His name was Thomas Day. They had made an acquaintance in Panama, to go and to build a British hotel near Balaclava, which is the modern-day Sebastopol, to be a mess table and comfortable quarters for sick and convalescent officers. So she traveled down to the Crimea in the very early part of 1855, and the British hotel was built with whatever she could scavenge or salvage from the surrounding areas. It opened in March 1855. She had several streams of income from this British hotel. She had the officers who stayed there. Her stated purpose was to have comfortable quarters for sick and convalescent officers.
And those are the folks who had a significant amount of money.
Yes, but it was also somewhat of a restaurant. It was also a store with many different supplies. She worked as a sutler, and I had to look up what that word meant, but it basically meant she sold supplies to the troops.
Oh.
She would pack up her mules. She would go to the different camps and sell items to the soldiers who were there. But she also, this blows my mind, she would sell refreshments to the battle spectators.
Spectators.
People from nearby towns would come to watch the battle, and she would sell them refreshments. And I know that that was the case in the Civil War as well.
It was a very common thing to do. If you're going to have a battle, you go out there and you watch it, because it is the Super Bowl of the day. In fact, we would see in the Battle of Manassas, or First and Second Manassas, or Battle of First and Second Bull Run, where you had congressmen and senators all and their ladies all going out in these carriages to watch the battle. And when the Union force loses, they had this mad dash back to Washington, D.C. and actually keep the army from retreating.
Wow.
It was a mess.
So she gets set up in Balaclava as a hotel, as a store. She talks about, I spent some portion of each day receiving visitors and selling stores, but my chief occupation, and one with which I never allowed any business to interfere, was helping the doctors to transfer the sick and wounded from the mules and ambulances into the transports that had to carry them to the hospitals. I did not forget the main object of my journey, to which I would have devoted myself exclusively had I been allowed. And very familiar did I become before long with the sick wharf of Balaclava.
And the sick wharf was where they brought the wounded and put them on transports to take them back for care.
Absolutely. So then she describes her British hotel. She says, "Let me in a few words describe the British hotel. It was acknowledged by all to be the most complete thing there. It cost no less than £800. The buildings and yards took up at least an acre of ground and were as perfect as we could make them. The hotel and storehouse consisted of a long iron room with counters, closets, and shelves. Above it was another low room used by us for storing our goods, and above this floated a large Union Jack. Attached to this building was a little kitchen, not unlike a ship's caboose, all stoves and shelves. In addition to the iron house were 2 wooden houses with sleeping apartments for myself and Mr. Day, outhouses for our servants, a canteen for the soldiery, and a large enclosed yard for our stock, full of stables, low huts, and sties. Everything, although rough and unpolished, was comfortable and warm, and there was a completeness about the whole which won general admiration. The reader may judge the manner in which we had stocked the interior of our store from the remark, often repeated by the officers, that you might get everything at Mother Seacole's, from an anchor down to a needle." So she is in business. She is selling products to the soldiers, she's selling products to the officers, but she is still putting a high priority on her medical services as well. She says, "I must solicit my reader's attention to the position I held in the camp as doctress, nurse, and mother. Mother is in quotes. I have never been long in any place before I found my practical experience in the science of medicine useful. Even in London I have found it to be of service to others, and in the Crimea, where the doctors were so overworked and sickness was so prevalent, I could not be long idle, for I never forgot that my intention in seeking the army was to help the kind-hearted doctors to be useful to whom I have ever looked upon and still regard as so high a privilege. But before very long I found myself surrounded with patients of my own, and this for 2 simple reasons. In the first place, the men, I'm speaking of the ranks now, had a very serious objection to going into hospital for any but urgent reasons, and the regimental doctors were rather fond of sending them there. And in the second place, they could and did get at my store sick comforts and nourishing food, which the heads of the medical staff would sometimes find it difficult to procure. These reasons, with the additional one that I was very familiar with the diseases which they suffered most from, and successful in their treatment, I say this in no spirit of vanity, were quite sufficient to account for the numbers who came daily to the British Hotel for medical treatment."
And we're going to see later just how much this help that she provided means to the soldiers.
Well, as part of her autobiography, a good chunk of one of the chapters, she just quotes or reprints letters and messages that soldiers that she treated sent her. Now, a lot of these, she talks frequently about soldiers that she helped in Jamaica, that she knew from Jamaica or from Panama, that she also sees in the Crimea. She talks about the 97th Regiment, which was apparently stationed in Jamaica, in Kingston, that she also saw over in the Crimea. And those were her boys, and she talks about several of them that she had close relationships with. One aspect of what Mary did that was particularly interesting to me is that she was in the thick of things. Rather than being away from the front lines where the hospitals were at a safer distance, she was pretty much on the front lines. She describes in her autobiography hearing the artillery in the battles constantly, particularly at night. At one point, she was pretty much in the middle of the Battle of Cholera. She said, "As summer wore on, busily passed by all of us at the British Hotel, rumors stronger than ever were heard of a great battle soon to be fought by the reinforcements which were known to have joined the Russian army, and I think that no one was much surprised when one pleasant August morning at early dawn, heavy firing was heard toward the French position on the right by the Cholera, and the stream of troops and onlookers poured from all quarters in that direction, prepared and loaded as usual." She's talking about having all the provisions on the mules that she was taking out to sell. "I was soon riding in the same direction, and saw the chief part of the morning's battle." She then talks about some of the services she extended. "I attended to the wounds of many French and Sardinians, and helped to lift them into the ambulances which came tearing up to the scene of the action. I derived no little gratification from being able to dress the wounds of several Russians. Indeed, they were as kindly treated as the others. One of them was badly shot in the lower jaw and was beyond my or any human skill." She also talks about, "I attended another Russian, a handsome fellow, and an officer shot in the side, who bore his cruel suffering with a firmness that was very noble. In return for the little use I was to him, he took a ring off his finger and gave it to me, and after I'd helped to lift him into the ambulance, he kissed my hand and smiled far more thanks than I had earned. I do not know whether he survived his wounds, I fear not. Many others on that day gave me thanks in words the meaning of which was lost upon me, and all of them in that one common language of the whole world, smiles." Now, this is an autobiography, and oftentimes in autobiographies, people tend to put, a rosy spin on their own actions, very understandably. They're somewhat biased, generally speaking. And as I mentioned before, she often includes excerpts from letters or recommendations from medical officers or whatnot. But I found this quote particularly interesting. She says, "It was on this, as on every similar occasion, that I saw the Times correspondent eagerly taking down notes and sketches of the scene under fire, listening apparently with attention to all the busy little crowd that surrounded him, but without laying down his pencil, and yet finding time, even in his busiest moment, to lend a helping hand to the wounded." Now, this again is in the middle of the Battle of Cholera. "It may have been on this occasion that his keen eye noticed me, and his mind, albeit engrossed with far more important memories, found room to remember me. I may well be proud of his testimony, borne so generously only the other day, and may well be excused for transcribing it from the columns of the Times. I have seen her go down under fire with her little store of creature comforts for our wounded men, and a more tender or skilful hand about a wound or broken limb could not be found among our best surgeons. I saw her at the assault on the Redon, and at the Cholera, at the fall of Sevastopol, laden not with plunder, good old soul, but with wine, bandages, and food for the wounded or the prisoners." She certainly gathered up all the nice things people said about her and made sure that they were in this autobiography.
Well, and the other thing, too, is that people wouldn't notice her because one of the things that she did was the way that she dressed.
Yes.
She always wore something bright with contrasting ribbons. Either it was like yellow or blue, and then with contrasting ribbons, so that she did stand out.
Part of her branding.
Yes.
She made herself very distinctive.
But now we come to 1856, and Russia has suffered devastating defeats. Their army has been shown to be totally incompetent. Alexander I has replaced his father because his father dies from the stress of the war, Nicholas I. Russia wants to end the war because they're afraid that Germany and Austria are going to join the war and actually invade them, and they're going to lose more territory. France and England want to get out of the war because the public is turning against it. In fact, in England, the government falls because of the conduct of the war. Everybody is kind of weary of the war, love to see it end. All of a sudden, it does.
Now, this was a bit of a financial difficulty for Mary Seacole. They had actually just received a new shipment of supplies, and as she mentioned before, everything from an anchor to a needle. There are other parts in her autobiography where she lists all the things that they were able to get. She has nobody to sell these to because they were pulling out troops as quickly as they could to take them back to England. So she eventually has to settle for auctioning off all of these supplies at just rock bottom prices. It's essentially a fire sale. At one point, she describes selling off this casket of wine bottles, and she just couldn't stand letting them go for the pennies on the dollar that she had purchased them for. And so she just smashed the bottles rather than sell them to her former enemies. So she's describing, as the British troops are being evacuated during the war, they're left with nobody to sell their products to. The poor old British hotel, we could do nothing with it. She says, we could sell nothing. Our horses were almost given away. Our large stores of provisions, etc., were at anyone's service. It makes my heart sick to talk of the really alarming sacrifices we made. The Russians crowded down ostensibly to purchase, in reality to plunder. Prime cheeses, which had cost us 10 pence a pound, were sold to them for less than a penny a pound. For wine, which we had paid 48 shillings a dozen, they bid 4 shillings. I could not stand this, and in a fit of desperation I snatched up a hammer and broke up case after case, while the bystanders held out their hands and caught the ruby stream. It may have been wrong, but I was too excited to think. There was no more of my own people to give it to, and I would rather not present it to our old foes. So there you have it. So in 1856, with this somewhat abrupt end to the war and her fire sale, she lost a great deal of money, she and her business partner, Thomas Day. She was pretty much bankrupt. Mm-hmm. She went back to England and had nothing.
And she did declare bankruptcy.
Yes, in November of that year. Now, at this point, however, she was kind of a press darling. In that quote that I just read, she had been mentioned in the Times. She was getting to be fairly well known, and so the press publicized the fact that she was bankrupt. A fund was set up, and many prominent people contributed to it. In fact, in July of 1857, so about, months or so after her bankruptcy was declared, the Seacole Fund Grand Military Festival was held at the Royal Surrey Gardens. It was a 4-day event supported by many military men. Over 1,000 artists performed, including 11 military bands and an orchestra. About 40,000 people attended the event.
Which is a remarkable number of people.
Oh, yes. However, she netted all of £57 from this event, which, is nothing to sneeze at, but certainly isn't going to set her up in style for the rest of her life.
That probably lasts most people maybe stretched to 2 years at best.
So in 1857, her autobiography was published that I've been quoting from all this time. It was the first autobiography by a black woman that was published in Britain, and it became a runaway bestseller. I just finished reading the whole thing, and she really has a delightful personality that comes through in this autobiography, in this writing. It's really kind of fun to read. As always, it's a first-person account, which, you maybe wonder if some of the details haven't been embellished a little bit, but it really is quite delightful. I can see why it was a bestseller at the time. So that put her on better financial footing. And in 1860, she went back to Jamaica. She ran into some more financial trouble, and about 7 years later, the Seacole Fund was resurrected. In 1870, she came back to London, where I found it very interesting. She was described as joining the periphery of the royal circle. Prince Victor, who was a nephew of Queen Victoria, had been one of Seacole's customers in the Crimea. And he carved a marble bust of her in 1871 that was exhibited at the Royal Academy exhibition in 1872. She also became the personal masseuse to the Princess of Wales at one point. So, periphery of the royal circle is probably pretty correct. She used some of her connections from the Crimea to, angle herself into a better position here, I think.
A clientele, again, that would pay her.
So in 1881, she passed away in London, and she faded into obscurity fairly quickly after that, until 1973, when her grave was rediscovered. In 1991, she was awarded the Jamaican Order of Merit, and then in 2004, as we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, she was voted the greatest Black Briton of all time. In 2005, a stamp in the UK had her picture on it.
And Jamaica.
Oh, Jamaica has had several stamps honoring her. And in 2007, she was added to the national curriculum of the UK. There are buildings named after her, and there's a statue of her. There's a nursing award named after her. So she's definitely come back to public memory at this point.
And with all this, There are a few controversies about her, however. Today, you don't think of Mary Seacole and Crimean War. Instead, you think Crimean War, Florence Nightingale.
And it's very interesting because in some quarters there seems to be an effort to put her up as competition for Florence Nightingale. Like it's a zero-sum game. If Mary Seacole gets any recognition, it's taking it away from Florence Nightingale and vice versa. And from my research, from what I've learned, I don't think that that's the case. I don't think that that has to be the case. I found a really fabulous paper written by Helen J. Seaton on victorianweb.org where she talks about the differences between what Florence Nightingale did and what Mary Seacole did. She said, the manner of their service was drastically different. Even before she went to the Crimea, Nightingale knew that surmounting the bureaucratic problems of the Army's medical services and establishing a female nursing group which authorities and medical men alike could respect was going to be more important than any individual patient care she might do. Nightingale gained her reputation by the organization of nursing services during the Crimean War. After the war, she worked tirelessly to improve public health and raise the status of nursing. The result of the introduction of women nurses into the British Army was no small matter in the history of nursing, and was a testimony to her tremendous public support in forcing the antagonistic military hierarchy to accept a female with authority into their ranks. She also experienced prejudice and resentment from doctors and the military establishment. Nightingale is being criticized for not doing more, for not being more progressive, etc., but she took on the establishment years before women could even vote. Mrs. Seacole's strength seemed to be in more hands-on activities, such as direct patient care. She was an entrepreneur who was able to use her skills as a merchant to finance her medical and nursing practice. It's probably true that Mrs. Seacole had more practical experience, especially with tropical diseases. However, both administrative and hands-on care are necessary for the effective delivery of health care. Both women made a great contribution to the history of nursing in their own way, and hopefully there's room for both of them.
And that, I think, is what's really important here, is that you have two different approaches to caring for the sick and the wounded. The bureaucratic side, which is where Florence Nightingale really excelled.
And which was very important.
It was, because until you broke down that barrier, you'd never have the organization put together that would support the wounded and the injured from the battlefield all the way back to home. And on the other hand, Mary Seacole was very much hands-on dealing with it. At the same time, that means that she can't help that many people.
Right.
Because there's only so many minutes in the day.
Another aspect of Mary Seacole that I find really interesting is the idea of the definition of nursing. Because what Mary Seacole did and the way that Florence Nightingale, for example, defined nursing were very, very different. If you go looking online, you'll find some sources that are really kind of antagonistic toward Mary Seacole, that really downplay what she did, saying that's not real nursing. But listen to this other section of Helen Seaton's paper. Nurses who were interested in what is now called advanced practice nursing pointed out that Seacole's practice and conduct was of great significance to the genesis and history of nursing. It is true that Mary Seacole did nurse, but her practice was far broader. Diagnosis, prescription, preparation of herbals and pharmaceutical medicine, a little minor surgery, and doing a post-mortem on a cholera victim to learn more about the effects of cholera. Seacole has also been called a nurse practitioner, independent practitioner, or advanced practice nurse because she performed a number of nursing and medical activities without direct supervision from a doctor. In fact, many doctors felt threatened by her ideas on cleanliness, good ventilation, nourishing food, and the separation of patients with contagious diseases. Furthermore, she financed her own practice due to her shrewd business skills in owning and managing her boarding houses and in being a sutler during the Crimean War. So again, we've got this idea of this is what nursing is, and she didn't fit inside of it, but a recognition of her expertise that spanned a broader spectrum than that smaller definition of nursing.
And if you look at her background, she came from a background where you didn't have a lot of doctors, or you may not have hospitals.
Right.
And so you see this on the American frontier. There's a lot of stories. In fact, Louis L'Amour includes them in a lot of his stories, and they're based on real people, where you have outbreaks of disease, and it's a woman who becomes the angel, who cares for all the sick cowboys and the miners and the settlers, because there was no doctor. And years later, they would remember that person, and if she was in trouble in any way, shape, or form, they'd run to her rescue.
Which very much sounds like is what happened here with their Seacole Fund Grand Military Festival and the funds they set up to help her.
Yes.
Hey, before we go, I want to let everyone know that right after this episode, we'll be releasing a mini cast about the Crimean War. Frank had a great, about 7-minute explanation of it that really just sums up the entire war, and we couldn't quite make it fit in this episode. We had to edit out about 80% of it, and we don't want you guys to miss out on that. So that should be the next episode you can listen to. You can also find it on our YouTube channel where we upload all of our episodes. So if you prefer to get your episodes on YouTube, you can head on over there. And if you haven't taken a chance to, please head on over to iTunes or YouTube or wherever you listen to our podcast and leave us a review. We would love to hear your feedback. Thanks for listening.